Hello, I'm Stanley Rabinowitz, Professor Emeritus of Russian Literature and Director Emeritus of the Amherst Center for Russian Culture. I'm delighted to be here this morning to chat with Andrew Kaufman from the class of 1991 about his most recent book, published a year ago, called The Gambler Wife, A True Story of Love, Risk, and the Woman Who Saved Dostoevsky. I just wanted to say an introductory word or two about the book, because it really seamlessly weaves Andrew's observations, his investigations, his conclusions about Anna's life and her complicated relationship with her husband into the larger picture of Dostoevsky's work and life as a writer. As you'll see, it's about Anna, but Andrew shows quite compellingly how the trials and the tribulations and the joys of his marriage very much reflected and even at times determined many of Dostoevsky's most important thematic concerns: psychological, spiritual, emotional. So I think you'll be in for quite a treat. Just a few words about Andrew, who came to us from North Muskegon, Michigan, and is the fourth of four brothers who graduated from Amherst College. That is a statistic for the record books. And so he was more or less comfortable here and a known quantity. Andrew majored in Russian and graduated summa cum laude, having written a very distinguished senior honors essay on the romantic writer, Mikhail Lermontov. He left us and went to Stanford University, where he eventually earned his PhD in Slavic languages and literatures there, and then made his way to where he is now, to the University of Virginia at Charlottesville, where he is currently many things. He is lecturer in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. He is what he's calling the associate professor in the general faculty, and also the assistant director of the Center for Teaching Excellence at the university. Very interestingly, because we have something like this at Amherst as well, he is the creator of the program called Books Behind Bars, which goes into prisons and speaks with incarcerated people about whatever literature they're reading. Andrew's last book, the book before this, published in 2014, received very enthusiastic responses from a wide variety, critics, writers, but also the general reader. And it was about his great love, Leo Tolstoy, about whom he wrote his PhD thesis. It's called Give War and Peace a Chance, Tolstoyan Wisdom for Troubled Times. I think that would make a very good segue into our discussion, Andrew, because after what you have called your lifelong journey with Tolstoy, what led you to Dostoevsky, and what specifically led you to telling the story about his second wife, Anna Snitkina?
So first of all, Stanley, thank you for that typically incredible introduction. You know me very personally and well from Amherst, and I just want to, for those of you who don't know, I credit you as the person who really stimulated my great love of Russian literature at Amherst. I met you on the very first day I arrived, and so it's very special for me to have you being the person interviewing me, so thank you. In response to your question, So it is true, I was always a Tolstoy guy. And as you know, there's a poorly kept secret in Russian literary circles that you either love Dostoevsky or you love Tolstoy, but you can't possibly love both because they're so different in their sensibilities. And for the longest time, I thought that was true. And it was true for me. I never connected with Dostoevsky. He was distant from my, my soul, my aesthetic. And but it wasn't until I started teaching in a prison that I really began to appreciate his genius, because Dostoevsky spent 4 years in a Siberian prison camp. It's a theme that resonated with the young, incarcerated youth. And so Dostoevsky really started to come alive for me. And so my interest shifted. And I started reading more about Dostoevsky, reading biographies. And when I was doing so, I kept coming across this name of his second wife, Anna Dostoevskaya, who I knew was, even from the biographies, was an important figure. But I wanted to learn more about her. When I went to go look for a biography about her, there was none in English. There were only 2 in Russian. Very little had been written about her. And so I started digging around her memoirs, archival material, memoirs of others who knew the couple. And what became clear to me from that is that Anna Dostoevskaya was not just important in Dostoevsky's life, she was instrumental in his life and career. Without Anna, we probably would not have the brothers Karamazov. We probably would not have The Idiot or The Possessed or The Adolescent or many of the great works of Dostoevsky. She supported him in every aspect. But what is even more interesting about her is who she was in her own right. And so I wanted to write a book about her, not just as Dostoevsky's partner, but as a woman who was extraordinarily accomplished and unique in her own right. She was Russia's very first solo female publisher. She founded one of Russia's the very first literary museum in Russia. She was the founder of one of Russia's first book distribution businesses. She was the founder of one of Russia's first parish schools for peasant children in the provinces. She started a business after Dostoevsky's death, publishing his complete collected works, which earned her, in today's money, $5 million from that endeavor. An extraordinary accomplishment for anybody, but especially for a woman at this time. And so it was clear to me that this was a serious omission from the record. Her story needed to be told. And it needed to be told from her point of view. And that's why I set out to write this book.
I wanted to just comment on one of the things you said early on, and that is you learned how important she was in the creation of Dostoevsky's more or less major works. And I wanted to say one of the distinguishing traits of the book, which I really profited from and have not seen before, is that in pretty much any biography I have read, whether it's personal or critical, obviously I'm reading about his writing, when he wrote it, what it's about, how it got published, et cetera, et cetera. But what your book shows, what you do, is to stress by reading her letters, quoting her diaries, how vital that personal relationship was and is in the creation of art. Very often we get this from on high. He went here, he met Picasso, she did this. In your case, you really allow us to enter into the personal, dare I say, life and laboratory, so that you realize that creation is not just statistics and critical response. It's the back and forth, the pull and the push of, in this case, everyday life. And so this project, of course, is about Anna, but it, because you do it the way you do it, allows us front row seats into the creative laboratory of Dostoevsky. I think that's one of its most important contributions. That's all I really want to say here. But speaking about Dostoevsky's writing, and of course his personal life, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about where he was professionally, where Dostoevsky was emotionally and personally in his life when Anna met him.
Mm.
Of course, as you say, he had been incarcerated. He was let out. He's back in Petersburg. What's happening now?
So yes, he had returned 7 years earlier from his incarceration, and he was, I think it was about 38, maybe 39. He had to rebuild his career because he had been forgotten. And so he started to do so, and he started to have a couple of works. That one was a commercially fairly successful, called The Insulted and the Injured. But where his career really started to take off is at the very time that he met Anna. He was publishing Crime and Punishment, and that is when people started to notice him. But even so, he was not yet a great writer. He was not yet known as a great writer. He was still an important writer, but he had not achieved what we now know of Dostoevsky. And so without Anna, he would not have done that. So on that front, things were starting to go better for him. However, on every other front, his life was a disaster. Personally, emotionally, he was distraught. His wife had died 2 years earlier. He was still in this on again, off again, tormented relationship with a secret lover, Polina Suslova, who toyed with his heart. He proposed to a couple of women, both who rejected him, and he was lonely. He was 40. He was 44, and he wanted, or 40, 44, and he wanted emotional companionship. And he was financially in serious trouble, as he always was. Dostoevsky was reckless with his finances, and he lent money hand over fist to people that he shouldn't have, and he had a gambling addiction. And so that's kind of the context. Now, let me tell you the specific thing that he did that led him to hire Anna as his stenographer. A year before he met Anna, he had signed a terrible publishing agreement with a notoriously unscrupulous publisher by the name of Fyodor Stilovsky. At the time, Dostoevsky badly needed cash. He was in debt, and he wanted to get to Europe to go gamble and to go see his secret lover. And so he was willing to sign this agreement with a publisher who gave him 3,000 ruble advance, which in today's money is about $25,000. And for that money, Dostoevsky gave the publisher the right to publish everything that he had written up to that point in a standalone edition, including works that were still in print. And he promised Stilovsky that he would get him a new novel by November 1st of 1866 to be published in that collection. And should Dostoevsky fail to deliver, he agreed that he would lose the copyrights on and the income from everything that he would write for the next 9 years. An awful publishing agreement. And so October 1st of 1866 rolled around, and Dostoevsky had not written a word of this promised novel. And so he turned in desperation to his friend, Petersburg stenography instructor by the name of Pavel. Oh my God, the name slips. I'm sorry. It will come back to me. But he turned to him and he said, "Who is your best pupil? Who is your best student?" And as it turns out, his best student was a young lady, 20-year-old by the name of Anna Snitkina. And so Anna was hired to be Dostoevsky's stenographer, to take down dictation so he could complete this novel. And with her, through her patience and her support and her efficiency, and she knew how to write in shorthand, Dostoevsky completed that novel in 3 weeks and averted financial and professional disaster. And so from the very first, from the moment she entered his life, Anna saved Dostoevsky's career. And that was how they met.
You know, it's clear that she was, perhaps most importantly, a stabilizing force in a life that was nothing short of a melodrama every day of the week. One of the factors that leads to this, as you were alluding to, is that this is Dostoevsky's second marriage. His first marriage left him with a stepson, that is the son of his first wife's first marriage, who basically tortured him during his entire life. And what I find fascinating is, again, your upfront, very close, very consistent tracing of how these family members, including his sister-in-law, the widow of his late, older, and very dear brother, until he died, gave him no rest. The reason I really am enjoying this idea is because your book reads like a Dostoevsky novel. And I'm wondering whether when you wrote the book, you really felt you were in one. That is, as you were doing the research and as you were putting together the development of his life and understanding how important his emotional responses to his relatives were in terms of his ability to write, whether you felt that this is no longer biography for Andrew Kaufman, but it's almost like either writing a novel or being in one. Do you have any thoughts about what you went through writing this?
That's a brilliant question. I'm really glad you asked that, because what's interesting is that the first draft of the proposal for this book was fiction. I was going to write this originally as a novel. And then my agent and I discussed a variety of factors. And then I realized that I have access to so many sources, such an intimate portrait of her life through her, through unpublished materials of her memoirs and letters and correspondence, archival materials, that it would actually be more interesting to tell the story where every fact is documentable. And so the impulse to tell this, to really focus on the story, and the reason I originally wanted to write it as fiction is because I was so moved by the story. It's a human story. It's a story of love. It's a story of the trials and tribulations and joys of marriage. It's a story of family relationships. It's a story of a woman who stands by her husband's side, through epilepsy and a gambling addiction, and frankly, childish behavior. It's a story that made me ask, why did she do that? Why did she stay with him? And so I loved writing it as a story, and rather than as a kind of academic book. And so it is the closest thing to a novel that I have ever written. And interestingly, a lot of people still mistakenly refer to the book as a novel, maybe even forgetting that it is actually nonfiction. So having said that, Stanley, the other thing that's important to mention is, so yes, I was in the story for long periods of time. I loved living in that story because I could come out of it at the end of the day. Anna and Dostoevsky could not come out of it. All the torments of the exile in Europe and the gambling addiction. They lived that. Well, I could live that too, but then remove myself at the end of the day and go have a normal dinner with my family. But at the same time, because it is nonfiction and because I wanted readers to understand the characters' motivations, that's when I did step away from the text and offer from time to time summary explanations, where they are in their relationship, why this relationship, which with anyone else would never have worked, it would have imploded, why it worked in their case, why this partnership worked. So I was very careful to both be in the story, but also stand outside of it and offer some outside perspective to help guide the reader in understanding the relationship, but also understanding the cultural and the historical context in which this is taking place.
Well, I'll make a plug for a book, of course, and I adore, and I actually teach at the end of my course that I've been giving recently on the Brothers Karamazov, and that is a fictional account of at least part of the Anna Fyodor Dostoevsky relationship, and that's Leonid Tsipkin's remarkable novel called Summer in Baden-Baden. I think it would be a wonderful, I'm saying this to anyone listening, a wonderful exercise to read both Andy's account and Tsipkin's account to see how many differences there are, but how many areas they share in common, which I may get to in a little while. But just on the notion of writing this and writing it ultimately as nonfiction, again, one of the book is a tour de force. I mean, that's the only phrase that comes to mind, because it is extraordinarily well researched. I think there are 24, 25 pages of footnotes. You go into all of the Russian sources, some of them available only recently. Your scholarly apparatus is impeccable. And yet the book is not academic. And I say that as a compliment. Very often footnotes and the lure of getting into all the details and the scholarly debates detracts from the smoothness, the flow that a good story should have. And so on the one hand, as I say, the scholarship is as good as if this would be purely critical, purely scholarly, sell 1,000 copies and used in courses. But what you manage to do is to turn this into, I won't dare say popular, but a very accessible, enjoyable, easy read about, when you look at the scholarship, something that was not so easy to put together. And so I understand why you could have done this either as a novel or as a nonfiction biography, or even something, again, very specifically, almost narrowly academic. But I'm fascinated by, of course, your interest in and your comment about what it was that Anna needed in Dostoevsky. What was she getting to keep her in that relationship? That is, it's obvious that he profoundly needed her. Later in life, he's got these debts, he's sick. It's equally clear that he often posed profound challenges to her to remain with him. I mean, this was not easy. She should have left. This is, in some senses, an abusive, it's a textbook case of an abusive relationship. And she participates, as you show, in Dostoevsky's torments, and she is tormented by him as well. She was, of course, a passionate partner for him. But I really do wonder, you mentioned it, but I'd love a little more detail. What do you think it was that encouraged her, dare I say, forced her to remain with him? Mm-hmm. Her heroism is the sheer forbearance that she had to stick it out. And I just wonder what you think really was at work there. There may be many things, of course.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions that I hope readers will ask themselves when they read this book is, should she have stayed with them? Would you have stayed with them? Because I know many people would argue that even the reviewer in the New York Times very explicitly said that that she's not even sure that it was worth it to Anna to go through all that she went through, and that was the reviewer's judgment. And I responded to that, and I thought about that a lot, because as a writer, you need, especially a book that is a story, you need to think about characters' motivations, and if the motivations don't make sense, the character doesn't make sense. So I thought a lot about this, and let me just offer a couple of ideas. So it's important to realize that Anna grew up with Dostoevsky's books. She was reading, he was her favorite writer. He was her father's favorite writer, even before she met him. So they'd subscribed to Dostoevsky's journal, and Anna would recall how her dad would fall asleep in his wing chair with the volume still in his hands, and Anna would run up to him and sneak and sneak off into the garden. with, one of Dostoevsky's novels that was published in installments in this journal. The Insulted and Injured, for instance, was one of her favorites, or Notes from the House of the Dead, his semi-fictionalized account of his time in prison. And so Anna loved Dostoevsky's writing. She had a deep sensitivity to it. In some ways, she was a very good and deep reader of Dostoevsky. At the same time, she was very ambitious. She was a member of the burgeoning feminist movement in Russia at the time. There was a movement in Russia, and women, young women and women in general, wanted to establish themselves, wanted to establish their own careers and not rely on a man to do so. And so that is why she went to stenography school, to learn something, to learn an art that she could then use and support herself. So her mother didn't have to support her. And so when this job came along with Dostoevsky, a writer that she knew, a writer that she respected, and a writer that needed her, an important writer in Russia, when this opportunity came along, it was the best of both worlds. That this partnership afforded her the opportunity for a meaningful career of her own, but also to support an important writer that she admired. And that is a detail that a lot of people don't realize, and that's important to understand. And the partnership, even as it became very difficult, this partnership meant a lot to her, even outside of her love for Dostoevsky. It was her opportunity to pursue a profession that she loved, publishing. She founded her own publishing company to start to publish the works of Dostoevsky. She founded a book distribution business. She supported his career in ways that weren't just about her love for him, and that she had, in droves. She supported his career in a way that allowed her to have a career. She was a businesswoman. And so those are some of the reasons that she stuck it out. But even during the period early in their relationship, when she experienced the worst of his gambling addiction, when they were in Europe for a 4-year honeymoon that was supposed to last for 3 years, and he was pawning her wedding dress and her wedding ring and all of that she hadn't started her business at that point. And so you might argue that during that time, it was a very codependent relationship. It was not clear what she was getting from this, aside from the fact that she did love him, and she loved him unconditionally. And she was very traditional in that sense, when many other progressive women would not have stayed with him. So it's that combination of what the partnership meant to her, the professional opportunities it afforded her, and yes, a deep love for this man, and a steely resolve to support him, even when many other women would have left. Those are some of the reasons that I think this worked for her, and she stayed.
What you have been saying, Andy, allows me to do something I wanted to do and didn't know whether I'd have a chance to, and that is to read an extended paragraph from the book. It's on pages 75 to 76, which ties together several things you have said and I have asked you. Once again, the book is, and I congratulate you for this, beautifully written. One of the real achievements, and as someone who's been in the business, I take my hat off to you, is what I call your exquisite narrative timing. You discuss all of Dostoevsky's fiction, but you have the discipline of doing it not always or consistently in chronological order. Not easy. The example that I'm thinking of, and it feeds very well into the question you were answering, what was it that kept her with him? And you said, well, she kind of knew him before she actually met him through his fiction. This is the part where Dostoevsky, you're talking about her as a very special woman, a feminist who might have had two models, if you like. And One was the model that Dostoevsky had been writing about, but was interrupted because he had to go to Siberia. And that is an early unfinished novel, Nyetochka Nizvanova. But the other one, of course, is Chernyshevsky's very famous novel, What Is to Be Done, which was written in 1863. And you use the two novels and the two heroines to show which model, which paradigm, the Nyetochka Nizvanova, was closer to Anna. But I want to read this because it captures so much about what I find good, excellent in this book. Here it is. By the time What Is to Be Done was published in 1863, of course, Nyetochka Nizvanova had long since faded from the spotlight. Yet for Anna Snitkina, it was Nyetochka's story, not Vera Pavlova's, that's the heroine of What Is to Be Done, that remained the archetypal story of female emancipation, the literary touchstone for her own identity as a woman. The parallels between Nyetochka and Anna are unmistakable. The worship of art and artists, their passion for reading. I was destined, Nyetochka says, to live through that future by getting to know it first in books. Most notably, Nyetochka's compassionate motherly feeling toward her dissolute stepfather, a quote, half-crazy man who seemed to me so pitiful, so humiliated, yet who aroused my fantasy, end quote, would find an eerie echo in Anna's compassion for her own husband, another troubled addict whose genius aroused her fantasy. And here is a wonderful line. And of course, one of the themes, one of the questions of the book is the old, does life copy art or does art copy life? It was as though Anna's relationship with Dostoevsky had begun in mysterious and complex ways long before they had ever met. So the writing is beautiful. You answer the question that in a way, she may have been waiting for someone like that to enter her life. And here he comes, and she knew immediately that despite the craziness and the abusiveness, she was willing to see it through. That's extraordinary. You mentioned, Andy, the feminist movement, what in Russia has been called the woman question. And you paint Anna Snitkina as a feminist in her own right during her lifetime, but she was, of course, criticized then and now for that. Can you talk about what seems to be her own complex, complicated relationship with feminism? That's a story.
Yes, and let me set the context because many readers are not aware that there was a distinct feminist movement in Russia in the 1850s and 1860s. And it was actually part of a sweeping series of reforms, the so-called Great Reforms of Alexander II, which modernized, all aspects of Russian society, the emancipation of the serfs. And the reason for those reforms is because of Russia's humiliating defeat in the Crimean War in the 1850s, and the recognition that they needed to catch up to the West, and so that these reforms were necessary. It's so interesting how history repeats itself, isn't it? Because we're in the Crimea once again. And so there were, at the same time, as part of this reformist, these reformist winds, there were calls for women to have more professional and educational opportunities so that they could play a more active role in helping to rebuild Russian society. Schools now were founded for women, one of which Anna herself attended. Universities opened their doors to women students, which they hadn't before. Women were trained as nurses and doctors. Business cooperatives founded by women started to appear. And so there's a lot of excitement in the air. And they called them, and then what happened in the 1860s is that the movement shifted, became much more radical. It went from a desire to offer opportunities for women to a desire to overthrow the entire social order, the entire traditional social order and political order, and to start all over again. And so it's not accidental that many of the feminists who grew up in the 1860s, and they were called radical feminists, aligned themselves with the revolutionary movement. In fact, Sofia Perovskaya, who was just a couple of years older than Anna, was executed for her assassination of Tsar Alexander II. And she was a young feminist, and that is where she got her start. And so the reason I mention this is to understand that Anna really came of age, and she was in her late teens in the 1860s, in this era of the radicalized feminist movement. Feminists, they intentionally smoked in public to irk polite society. They didn't dress, in typically feminine ways. They cut their hair short. They wore blue spectacles. And above all, they did not marry. They did not believe in traditional marriage. They believed in what was called fictitious marriage, which was the man and the woman would go through the motions of a marriage so that it appeared that they got married. It would give the woman legal cover, and then the man, if he was enlightened, would encourage the woman to go off and take multiple lovers if she wanted, to go off and pursue a career. So that was how you married at the time as a radical feminist. So Anna came of age when all of this was happening. And she was very influenced by it, and she proudly called herself a, quote, emancipated girl of the 60s, which is how the feminists referred to themselves. And she had many of their qualities. She was ambitious. She was smart. She was a risk taker. She didn't want to rely on a man for her career success. So in many ways, she embodied all of the traits of the radical feminists. But in some very important ways, she was very different from them as well. Anna believed in traditional marriage. She believed that she wanted the blessing of her mother. Her father had passed away a few years earlier. She wanted the blessings of her mother in her choice of husband, and she wanted a church ceremony. And so Anna, what makes her so interesting is that she is this fascinating combination of both a radical progressivism, but also a radical traditionalism. She didn't fit into either category. And that is what makes her so interesting, and someone who literally rewrote the script of what it means to be a feminist in 19th century Russia.
Not easy, but she pulled it off, I think. I wonder, since we don't have too much time left, whether there's anything else you haven't said about what you believe her legacy is and what you would hope that your readers take with them from the book that you have written about her.
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned before this book, there had not been a book about her in English, a biography of her. And so, first and foremost, what I wanted to do is to make sure that people understand that this woman wasn't just the wife and the partner of Dostoevsky. She was a powerhouse in her own right. She was a woman well ahead of her times, but a woman who was subtle and complex enough to combine various elements of traditionalism and progressivism and make them her own. And she was a woman who made an extraordinary contribution to Russian literary history as a female publisher, as in her own right, as a founder of one of Russia's first book distribution businesses. So first and foremost, I wanted to make sure that people knew who this woman was. The problem and why she is not better known, and why it is assumed that she is, was just a traditional wife to Dostoevsky, is because she herself crafted that narrative. She was a victim of her own success. In her memoir, she intentionally wanted to create a portrait of herself, which made her but a footnote in Dostoevsky's life. And she wanted him to be the star. And she succeeded so well that for generations, people just assumed that was true. And the problem is she ends up coming off appearing more traditional and more passive and much less complex than she in fact was. And so that is a portrait that I wanted to shift. I wanted to shift the narrative with apologies to Anna for uprooting her own narrative that she wanted to craft about herself. I want to give her her turn in the spotlight.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say that I hope readers take away from this book is, we live in a very divisive time right now. It is very easy to stereotype and to demonize and to basically side with people on your team, whether it's political or ideological. But people aren't like that. People aren't one or the other. People are much more complex, as Anna illustrates. And so I wanted to tell a deeply human story that transcends politics, that transcends ideology, in the hopes that people maybe see themselves in this complex character.
I wish we had more time. I do, to go on. There are so many other questions. I just, again, would like to be somewhat personal about it, and see whether readers who will open the covers of this book, hopefully soon, will agree. Obviously, your book reminds us of the miracle, the mystery of Dostoevsky's art, by showing us, I think, as close as we're ever going to get to the tortured, the complex process of this art's creation. Now, that can sound like a cliche, and perhaps others have done it, but I think you have managed to bring us through Anna, and only through Anna, through that marriage, through that relationship, as close as we'll ever get to that mystery. Because I think you show, but on such a personal, direct, almost gut level, the levels of Dostoevsky's writing that I believe obsess all of us. A fascination with an unorthodox and contradictory life and body of work. His extraordinarily conflicting experience, attitudes, descriptions of the emotions of love and hate and how they're intertwined. And this is what I feel and others have felt, and this is what she shows us. She may have been the first. The forbearance and the frustration, the acceptance and the rejection of a man, the strength of whose faults, and boy, were there many, the strength of whose faults could only be exceeded by the power of his creations. And it's that kind of mystery why we are attracted to a man who is so, on so many levels, repulsive. And yet she's the one who can help us balance the two, and finally, I think, come out on the side of you forgive, you go beyond, because ultimately there is the creation. So I thank you, as readers will, Andy, for a lovely job. I know you say in your introduction, you spent 8 years on this. It was a labor of love, and I hope others will have the pleasure of delving into this work that I think those who already have registered. So with this, we will conclude, and I have no doubt you'll write another book. I do have doubts about what condition I'll be in when it's finished, if I'm asked to do this again. But for now, good to see you, and thanks very much. So we end with this.
Thank you, Stanley. That was beautiful.
You're very welcome. Very welcome.